Hi, this is Pete here at Spoken Spanner, and this is Sally. And today we're going to be looking at this classic Ninja 125. Oh, there goes Sally. She'll be back later with the spanners. The bike's had quite a hard life. It was purchased at auction following it being stolen and then recovered, and the current owners had a couple of spills as well, so there's a fair bit of work to do today.
The story of Kawasaki starts in 1937, when the Meguro Manufacturing Company was co-founded by Hobiju Murato with Takachai Suzuki. They started producing special motorcycles for the Japanese police and military. At the time, Meguro motorcycles were the main competitor to Honda. In time, government orders dried up, so they tried producing light motorcycles, but the company went bankrupt. That's when Kawasaki Heavy Industries Limited acquired the brand, and in 1965, the Kawasaki emblem appeared. After the Wall Street crash, Meguro had invested in Harley-Davidson and gained drawings, tooling, and important knowledge of metal heat treatments to make gearboxes. The American intellectual property taught the Japanese how to produce motorcycles in quantity. Motorcycle production was restricted due to the start of World War II, during which Meguro and Kawasaki supplied aircraft parts. And only in 1948 started full production again, including the Z97 being joined by 125, 250 and 350 overhead valve singles. Working together, Kawasaki and Meguro produced the Kawasaki Meguro Works 125, 175 and 250 singles. The 500cc T-Series twin-cylinder model was later developed, and in 1965 Kawasaki bought out Meguro and the Kawasaki emblem appeared. They bought out the twin to a 650 with some design and cosmetic changes to make Kawasaki's first complete big bike. And they sold 3,282 of this single carb model, and as they say, the rest is history. Ultimately, Japanese bikes became associated with quality, but fast forward to today, and like many manufacturers chasing costs down and making bikes a disposable commodity, the bikes are made in Indonesia, frequently with parts from China. That is certainly the case with this smallest capacity machine that carries the Ninja name and that needs a new clutch and other interventions.
So this 2020 Ninja 125 has just 3,900 miles on the clock. We'll have a look at the good side first. And down here you can see that we've already replaced the sprocket and chains with a DID chain set. And the two clip-on handlebars were bent. The left one you can see we've already replaced, and the right one is still to be done. If we walk around to the other side, well, that's a slightly different story. You can see where the bike has come down and the indicator needs dealing with. But fundamentally today we're going to be dealing with the clutch. As a result of the chain letting go and going tight and then loose, it's jammed the engine when it was running and caused the clutch to slip excessively until finally it's burnt out. So the first job is to get the oil drained, but before we do that, in order to gain access to the clutch housing here, we're going to need to remove some of the panels, particularly this black panel to the back of the clutch housing. And it also looks like the whole of this fairing piece. Now that might be harder than it seems with all of this damage at the front, but we'll see how we get on. So this rear panel here is held on by two 4mm Allen head bolts. So we just remove those. And these little push fit clips down here can be particularly pesky. They have a center that pushes in. I have just eased that one out, and you've got to just take them out far enough, and then that allows the two parts of the fairing to separate. And there's another one underneath which I'll do in a moment. Right, with all of those clips off, you can see the fairing is quite fragile, but it should be a relatively simple matter now to just disconnect the push fit connectors here and to disconnect the wiring for the indicator, which will then allow us to remove this fairing in its entirety. So there were a couple of other little push-out clips, and then once you get behind the fairing, you can see that this is the wiring for the indicators that will separate. So the fairings do remove fairly easily. So that's that plug that we've just taken off, and you can see there's quite extensive damage to this fairing. I mean, we're having to be very fragile with it and support it for the moment. Really need to find another one, although we might have a look at whether that can be repaired in due course. This is a voltage rectifier regulator and the radiator, and this is the header tank for the coolant. So this is the oil drain plug to the rear of the engine. It is removed with a 14mm socket. I've got my oil drain can underneath. We've drained the oil. The next job is to remove these 3 8mm bolts that hold the cover for the oil filter. Once we've done that, we'll be removing the clutch cable, and we'll also have to drain the coolant. There's a little drain screw under there. Once that's done, the whole cover on the side of the engine here will be removed, held on by 10 8mm bolts. So first we'll get on with opening up the oil filter. Okay, so don't go using a blowtorch or anything, but I use this heat gun. It's sold for paint stripping, but it has lots of useful applications in the workshop, including shrink wrapping electrical connections, and this sort of job where I just want to gently heat up these rubber pipes to remove them. Obviously steer well clear of any fuel or electrical connections. We just play this over the pipe. And once you can feel that's warm, you can feel it's gone quite soft. And then I'll put a screwdriver under the leading edge of the pipe. And what I do is lever the pipe away from the spigot. That tends to break the seal, and then you should find it's relatively simple to remove. We'll tuck that out the way and get on to the next one. There's a similar job underneath, lever out, and pull it off. Now I can see there's a bit of corrosion around this spigot. That's quite normal, although it does tend to indicate that the coolant hasn't been changed in this motorcycle as often as it should be, and so its anti-corrosion properties are not functioning in the way that they're intended. It is something I find tends to be left from being done, either in the workshop because it's not part of the motorbike service schedule, or because owners think it's a hard job to do. There's other jobs like that, such as lubricating the rear shock linkage. It's really important, it tends to get neglected, and we'll cover that in another video. A couple more little jobs to do now before we get to the main event. The first one is that this wire that goes to the lambda sensor on the exhaust here just needs to be released so that it's clear of the casing of the engine. And the other is to disconnect the clutch cable. That's quite straightforward. You'll need a 12mm spanner. We loosen off the inner nut first. So I've just done a zoom in here because, as you could tell, removing that clutch cable was not quite as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. There's a little cam in here that when the clutch lever here rotates, it actually stops the end of the cable being able to come out. And what I found you've got to do is, if you pull this outer piece forward and then push in that way and push back, then lo and behold, the cable comes out in quite a straightforward way. So there we go, there's a lesson learned. If you want to remove it altogether, you then have to take this little screw, the back screw for the adjustment, all the way off. And then pull back on the cable, and there's a groove underneath here, and you can get that out. So that cable's now removed, which I think we needed to remove, because I'm not sure, but we may have to remove this mounting nut. One of the features about this Ninja 125 is there's actually very little literature available online for it at all. And it looks like we also need to move this banjo bolt, which has got an oil feed to the engine, a rigid feed coming off of it. So we need to take that off as well, in order that the whole of this casing where it connects to the engine can be removed to access the clutch. So after that little episode with the clutch cable here, I'm now going to get at this banjo bolt, which is the oil feed from the oil filter, using a 12mm socket. Let's get on now. I'm only using a 1/4" drive, so I'm not putting a great deal of force on this, as none of these things should be particularly tight. There we go. And I will put a list of tools that have been used for this whole project at the end, along with the torque settings. Might lose a bit of oil when I take this off. Normally a copper washer of some sort on each side of a banjo, but we'll see what's in there when we take it off. The so-called banjo bolt, because you'll see it has this little hole down the middle, which allows the oil to flow through the center and out to the ends. And yes, indeed, there's little copper washers in there. You should replace those. There should be one on the other side as well that we'll get to when we remove the side of the engine. And I just have a collection of copper washers that I can replace those. But you should replace them each time, because they are a single compression use. So once they've been compressed, then they are of not much use again. And there you can see, if I slide a screwdriver in, you can actually see that copper washer. I'll just take it out so it doesn't drop anywhere. And I'll just pop it back onto the bolt so I can size those up with some new ones when we've done the job. Okay, so now we are on to the main event, which is removing all of the 10 small little bolts that are holding the whole of this side of the cover onto the engine. Sometimes on some bikes you get a separate cover for the clutch. Would make life a whole lot easier, I have to say. But when we take this off, one of the other things, and we'll see how it goes, but these clutch operating mechanisms are sometimes preloaded against their springs, so that when you remove them, they'll rotate back to another position. And you've just got to make sure when you reassemble it that you get that in the correct orientation, that everything's functioning correctly. And that's what they look at. Now, some of these bolts on many engines are of a different size. Good tip here is that get a piece of cardboard and draw a rough picture of the item that you're dismantling. Pop a hole in each of the slots in the same location of the screws. That way, you can't go wrong if you're putting the original screw back into the original hole. So that's a useful top tip. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, I've taken this piece of cardboard just from a Coca-Cola packet, and I've just drawn a rough idea of what the shape of the item is, and key features like the clutch housing, oil filter, oil filler plug that have some reference to where the bolts are. And then I'm just taking a Stanley knife and putting a little cut or a hole in each of the positions where I want to put a bolt. Okay, and then when you remove a bolt, you can look at your diagram and insert that bolt through your cardboard. This way, you can always be sure you're putting the same screw back in the location that it came from. It's not entirely necessary when all of the screws are the same, but you're not going to cause any problem by doing it. And as we go around, you may find that there's different size screws or bolts, and then it's really helpful to have kept them in order. Now this bolt, as you can see, was a much stiffer one to remove, and that's because on this bolt you can see that this thread locker has been applied. Very good reason for keeping that bolt aside. We'll clean out those threads and apply some new thread locker when we put it back together. So trying to remove this impeller nut, all that actually happens is that you seem to manage to rotate the engine because it's being driven off the crankshaft. Oh no, that's come off. There we go. Just by holding it still, it's not to, again, a very high setting. And just put that safe. If it had been too tight to remove, then I would have taken the cover off the timing bolt on the other side of the engine and got an assistant to hold the engine still on the timing bolt while I loosen this one. This should allow us now, there we go, to remove. Now I heard something drop down inside there. I may have to remove this lambda sensor altogether. Now I think what's dropped down is the little cam that operates the clutch, as I mentioned to you at the start of the video. So at the rear of the engine here, there is a connection for the lambda sensor. So we can simply disconnect that, and then the cable will drop down because you won't be able to unscrew it from the exhaust because of twisting the wires there. Now we've removed the connection on the lambda sensor and that's clear, then we should be in the clear to remove the casing. Just be very careful because obviously something's dropped down inside from the cam at the top. There's quite a tight rubber seal fit where and there it goes into the bottom. There it is. Okay, and now you can see the clutch basket, which is where we're going to be working on to replace those plates. And now we've removed this cover, this gasket should be replaced, and the piece that you heard drop down was the little thrust piece that goes into the center, and there's a little cam, if you can see that lifts. But if I pop the unit back into the position, you'll see that as I rotate it, it pushes out. And the purpose of that is that bears on the thrust bearing on the clutch, and that's what actuates the clutch. It's only a very small amount of movement necessary in order to do that. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the next stage, which is to remove the clutch basket. And we do that by removing these 4 thrust bolts, and they hold the springs that hold the cage in. So that's the pressure that you're pushing against when you pull on the lever. Just before we do that, in the bottom of the engine here, you'll see I'll remove it. There's a strainer, and this is the primary strainer for the engine oil. It just slides out. I can show you that there's some dirt on there. So while you're inside the engine, although you've got the oil filter as well that's circulating and filtering the oil, it makes a lot of sense just to take the strainer out and to clean up any debris that's on there before you reinsert it and assemble the engine. So I've zip tied the clutch cable out the way, and I'm now going to remove the thrust bolts from the clutch cage. Now these have to be removed progressively because they're under tension from the springs. 10mm socket again. So your friend on these jobs is your 10mm and 8mm socket. And they're not tight. Don't think that you've got to tighten these bolts up when you put it back together really tight. They're actually to only a very low torque setting. But because they're under pressure from the clutch springs, then they stay tight. And like I say, I will give you all of the torque settings at the end of this video and tell you about them as we reassemble it. And you'll notice as you loosen these bolts that they go tight and loose because you're gradually moving the compression onto different bolts as you rotate them. But I can see that the springs are starting to expand until there's no tension on them, and then I'll be able to carefully remove this. Now this stage, it's really important you don't mess up the position of the clutch plates, because without a manual for this bike, I need to know what order they go back into in the correct orientation so that the clutch works properly at the end. And we'll look at that when we do the job, and I'll show you the before and after of the clutch plates that we remove. We're ready to remove the clutch basket, and this is the first specialist tool I'm going to be using today. This is a clutch holding tool that locks between the fins, and we'll do a close-up in a moment, but locks between the fins on the basket. And I've uprated, because this center bolt that holds the clutch basket is to a much higher torque, so I've uprated to a 1/2-inch drive, 14mm socket and an extension to go onto there between the clutch tool. The way you use this is very simple. It just clamps so that you can get purchase and hold the clutch basket still while you put your socket on, and then you can oppose to remove the bolt. Okay, now don't be deceived how tight this center bolt is. They are extremely tight, so I've employed the assistance of Dylan here, my able assistant, to hold the clutch tool because to stop it from twisting, and now I can get a proper purchase on that bolt, and it's coming off. But it is quite tough, and you can't do it without one of these clutch holding tools, but they're not terribly expensive. You can find them in lots of motor factors and on the internet, and then you can get this job done. Sometimes you even need to use an even longer bar to get greater purchase on that bolt. And there we go. That's the bolt that holds the clutch basket in place. So we can now remove the clutch holding tool. But before we remove the clutch basket, you can see there's various lines, pen lines that have been drawn, and they're to assist you in getting the orientation of the clutch basket in the correct position with this gear wheel here. So we know where they are at the moment, and then we can withdraw the entire clutch housing assembly in order to undertake the works to replace the clutch plates. The next stage is to take the clutch basket, and I'm going to disassemble it. I've kept this line that we saw in the video before. I'm going to keep that at the top of my workbench when I take it apart, so that each of the clutch plates are always in the same orientation. Let's zoom in and have a look at that. Okay, so I'm just going to drop that bearing out at the back. It's got the two holes on. It doesn't seem to matter which way round that goes. And then I'm going to turn the clutch housing over and remove the shell with this line to the top. That way you can see now that I'm keeping the orientation of everything in the same place. And there's a washer here. Just be aware of that washer. So I'm going to sit that back in the cage. Now you can already see the evidence of the burning out of this clutch, where the oil's got so hot it's burnt onto the back of the basket plate here, and that's because the drive chain on this bike had started to let go. The result of that was that it went tight and then slack and tight and slack, and that was stopping the engine in motion, leading to the clutch slipping until it burnt out in the way that it has today. The rider was actually very lucky that the chain didn't come off. That's another thing that can happen. If the chain comes off the sprockets, normally it will cause some significant damage to the engine casings, and also potentially, of course, it could lock the back wheel and spit the rider off the bike, and we don't want that to happen. So the next stage now is that we're going to take these various plates apart. So that's the back. And so the first plate on there is one of these plates, the 0597. Then you've got one of the metal plates, and you can see by the discoloration of this how hot this has actually got. If you look at the new plates, you can see that they are shiny and silver, and these ones are completely blackened. So we've got a 0597, then a metal driven plate, another 0597 that's done at an angle to it. Then we've got another metal driven plate, again burnt, and another 0597 metal plate, 0597, a metal plate, and then that rather different shaped 1077 plate. I seem to only here have two of the 0597. I don't think the owner's given me all of the parts that he purchased, and I need to just get hold of those before we can reassemble this. And then against the inside are a couple of different thickness thrust washers. One is thicker than the other. The thicker one goes to the outside. Disassembling this clutch, we found that the part of the clutch basket is fractured from the heat all the way around, and this would be close to breaking up and a potential engine seizure. So we're going to have to stop until we can get a new one of these components. So here we are, back from our ride, and a great shout out to those people at Derby Kawasaki for the deal they did us on those missing friction plates. And we avoided the temptations of the ZX-10R. Although sage words of advice from the salesman, doesn't matter what you buy, you're going to change it in 6 months anyway. So let's get those parts and get back to the table, see what new pieces we've got, bit of cleanup, and we'll be ready to reassemble that clutch. Right, back at the parts table, what have we got now? We've got the gasket to go around the casing. We've now got a full complement of 4 friction plates, as well as 4 intermediate metal plates, and the final outer friction plate. We've also got a new oil filter, sort out that oil, a drain plug, crush washer, and an O-ring to go around the oil filter housing. And probably the most interesting part, of course, is our clutch wheel with the this is what it looked like with the oil burnt onto it, and this is the new one, what it should look like. This is one of the most interesting things, because although the right plate has got all of this discoloured burnt on oil, and I highlighted the cracks and fractures in that plate, unfortunately when the new one arrived, although it's obviously clean and shiny on the left as you can see, It also has the same fractures and splits in the plate. When I challenged the Kawasaki dealer in this regard, the response was, well, they're Chinese parts, just put it in, it'll be fine. And clearly that's something which doesn't sit too well, but here we go, we'll put it back together and see how we get on.
Well, there you have it. Strange in my view that alloy castings should be supplied like that. I'm sure Chinese parts could be fine provided quality control is introduced. And so it seems the wear to the driven face and the burnt on oil are the only effects of the clutch failure this time. Perhaps those small capacity bikes are becoming disposable products, as I was also told that if major components like the crank fail, they're not available and the bike is, well, scrap. Anyway, next time we'll get it all put back together and sort a few of the other foibles so she's back on the road. Meanwhile, here's Sally, taking a well-earned swim in the sea. If you like and subscribe below, you make it possible for me to keep producing content for your enjoyment. So please keep doing that and we'll see you next time.